welcome, guys, to the Transgender Plan, your go-to podcast for transgender history. I am your host, Mari, and of course, you guys already know that I have some brand new content for you. Whenever we come up into this, these new episodes that we get into, nothing that I give you guys is going to be repetitive. Now, I will say at times that there might be some things that cross-function together, and some events might happen because another event occurred. But at the same time, I don't just always want to talk about events. I do want to go ahead and actually talk about those who actually pioneered and advocated for us within the transgender history as well. Because if it wasn't for them, a lot of things that happen today wouldn't happen because of them. So today, the person I'm actually going to be discussing is a man who not only advocated for our rights, but he also advocated for our health as well. And he did a lot of work within the medical community. And if it wasn't for this man right here, I honestly don't think a lot of things that we have within the medical field would happen because of the work that he has done. So, to go ahead and get started on episode 3, I want to introduce you guys to a man by the name of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who is a gay German sexologist who pioneered the knowledge of human sexuality and the advocacy of not only the transgender community, but also for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and even the intersex community as well, and our human rights for centuries ago, especially at a time when it was highly controversial. He fought against centuries of ignorance and prejudice, and transvestism was actually one of his research topics. Hirschfeld was the first doctor to publicly investigate and advocate for patients whose gender, who they claimed didn't match their gender assigned at birth. So basically what we identify as the terminology is transgender for today. Now, I do want to give a disclosure, of course, before I go ahead and continue on with Mr. Hirschfeld. I do not speak a lick of German. So a lot of terms that you might hear within this podcast today actually will have some German terminologies within it. And I deeply apologize, of course, ahead of time for those who are very frequent in the language of German. If I pronounce or botch any words, I tried my best, of course. I Google Translate it before I got started, and I don't think that my tongue is very good with the German language. So I apologize ahead of time, of course, for those who do speak a lick of German, and I might say some words that you're kind of just like, that's not how you pronounce it. So I apologize, of course, ahead of time. But I do want to point out, too, I like to go in the background of things that I'm going to be talking about, and that's not only with people, but it's always with events as well. So with Magnus, I'm going to actually give a little background of him and basically how he came about within the transgender community. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Now, Magnus was actually born in an Orthodox Jewish household. He had an interest and fascination with sex as a child, and even when he was younger, he saw sexuality as something technically perfectly normal and wholesome. Of course, despite the traditions of today and the moralisms of his parents, just due to his background. His father completed his own medical studies. He did some time in the military, and finally had settled as a member of the Jewish community's Deputy Assembly, and then climbed to a higher rank as a medical counselor. Not really much is known about his mother, but she did produce around 11 children who all were mostly involved in the medical field, and they all actually ended up becoming very successful at it as well. When Magnus was 17 years old at the time of his father's death, he deliberately rejected his Jewish family's religious history. And they think that this kind of traced back to his undergraduate days, honestly. So Hirschfeld's detractors were able to defame him as a Jew despite his isolation from his Jewish origin. Hirschfeld was forced to accept his own ancestry by the Nazis, and Hirschfeld actually avoided talking about his own personal life. To today, his diaries, if he had any, had been lost, and although he saw himself as a quote-unquote public figure, yet he already knew that he had to keep his personal life hidden from view without actually hiding it, So as a result, we don't really know if he had any life partners or long-term friendships or any relationships at all. His father was actually unable to save enough money to support his family, so he had to rely on relatives to pay for his education. Magnus studied in several countries between the years of 1887 and 1894 before actually settling in Berlin. He had first enrolled to study modern languages, but then he later had switched it to medicine for obvious reasons. During his time in medical school, he was shocked by a presentation on sexual degeneracy, in which a gay man who had been confined in a mental institution for 30 years because of his homosexuality was paraded naked in front of students like a laboratory animal, from what Hirschfeld had told. Hirschfeld was the only one of the students who was outraged by the treatment, so following his initial medical examinations in 1890, he served in the military for a year and a half, and after that he had underwent 3 clinical semesters, and one of those actually being in Berlin, and once he finished his dissertation, he actually was awarded his MD in February of 1892. After his completion of his MD, he returned to Germany after a time of travel and established a nice medical practice in Magdeburg in 1894. He relocated to Berlin 2 years later, where he became involved in a scientific study of sexuality and particularly homosexuality, as well as advocacy work on behalf of sexual minorities. It was at Magdeburg that Hirschfeld experienced the encounter that he later regarded as the trigger for his medical and scientific interest in homosexuality. A patient, a young military officer, had shot himself the night before his own wedding, which his parents claimed that they were looking forward to, of course, but in that he had revealed the reasons for his suicide in a suicide letter to his doctor and urged Hirschfeld to teach the hostile people around him about the fate and fortune of homosexuality. Hirschfeld's deep sense of sorrow and remorse had prompted him to research homosexuality and then eventually to create a pamphlet advocating for the decriminalization of gay conduct, which was banned under German Penal Code paragraph 175 at the time. Hirschfeld had devoted his time to educating doctors, and he also created the Yearbook of Sexual Intermediaries and the Journal of Sexual Science, which were among the medical journals that he had authored. Hirschfeld and a few of his colleagues had formed a scientific humanitarian committee 6 years later, which he had led until 1929. The committee was the first to successfully form an organization advocating for gay rights, and its approach was to educate, study, and teachings on all aspects of sexuality with a focus on debunking homophobic prejudice and presenting a reasonable argument for homosexuality's decriminalization. The committee's principal task was to petition for the removal of Section 175 of the German Penal Code, which had been in effect since 1871. It made homosexuality activity by men illegal, so petition after petition was presented to Parliament from 1897 through the 1920s. By each time, it was rejected. And this petition was the cornerstone of Germany's homosexual rights movement. And of course, as membership grew, the group launched a popular sex educational program in addition to the petition drive. My apologies. It was requested by homosexuals that it would be delivered to their relatives as educational material, and they authored essays, of course, in addition to this, in scholarly journals and books, and as well as medical periodicals. So look, not much later, Hirschfeld was sued for defamation on behalf of students involved in conservative and church groups after sending out questionnaires. Hirschfeld had a lot of opposition from other gays and lesbians, which was really one of his main issues, surprisingly. They mainly accepted their legal status as second-class citizens, guys. And for many people, they disliked him, for rocking the boat because they thought that he would be a troublemaker. Or they thought he actually was a troublemaker. Actually. They will always decline to take part in his sexual surveys and the fight for legal reform. But then again, Hirschfeld also attempted homosexuality as a natural spectrum of human sexuality by, providing science for it to technically be one, right? He used the most up-to-date and advanced medical knowledge and logic available at the time to prove that. Now, as the Department for Sex Education, the committee was eventually merged into the Institute for Sexual Science. At the same time, it looked for collaborative partnerships with other organizations. As his influence kept progressing, Hirschfeld continued to start on multiple sexological professional organizations. Hirschfeld continued his medical research into the causes and nature of homosexuality to bolster the rational, scientific case for legal reform in the hopes that better understanding the realities will reduce prejudice and increase acceptance. But Hirschfeld's activism went beyond the decriminalization of gay male sexuality, of course, which is also important. Hirschfeld's name is synonymous with the concept of sexual intermediacy, which is a succinct statement of his findings. The notion of sexual intermediacies is based on the idea that all human qualities, whether physical or psychological, appear in a feminine or masculine form or, in rare situations, androgynous. Hirschfeld divided these qualities into four broad categories in order to make the variations more understandable. You have sex organs, other physical characteristics, sexual orientation, and other psychological characteristics as well. He was far ahead of his time in concluding that everyone is a combination of masculine and feminine traits. However, this astute analysis led him to incorrectly assert that lesbians and gay persons were an intermediate sex who were biologically predetermined at birth. Male homosexuals, he said, had a woman's soul trapped in a man's body. Hirschfeld transitioned his focus from those who identify within the homosexual population to intersex individuals. When intersex, of course, became publicly known, Hirschfeld attempted to assist individuals in overcoming their daily struggles. After the German Civil Code went into action in the 1900s, those born with quote-unquote ambiguous sex organs had a harsher treatment situation than they had under the previous Peruvian law. In such instances, the German Civil Code stipulated that the sex of the newborn child be decided by the physician or midwife, with the decision to be final. This determination had been tentative prior to 1900s, and after becoming 18, those who were intersex could choose whether he or she, or nowadays they, wanted to live as a male or a woman, in the future. Hirschfeld always considered the affected individual's final identity over his or her own life to be the most ethical regulation. Here's another tip. Hirschfeld was successful in persuading the police to issue transvestite licenses for this organization, at least in Berlin. These were simple typewritten identification cards with a picture and an official stamp verifying that the individual who has possession of this card is dressing as the opposite sex. So let me, of course, give an example if you don't know. A woman in possession of a card was known to wear, quote-unquote, men's attire. Around the early 1930s, Dorchen Richner was the individual to have the first documented male-to-female genitalia transformation surgery. Alongside his work with transformation surgery came Eugene Stein, who was an endocrinologist who first identified the sex hormones testosterone and estrogen. Hirschfeld had established a treatment paradigm for homosexuals and other sexual intermediates that was more likely to meet his political ambitions, while also being beneficial to those who were impacted. In a nutshell, he invented, or at least invented a prototype of, the self-help group. Hirschfeld referred to this method as adaptation therapy. So basically, the physician must first determine whether the homosexual seeking consultation has any biological problems before examining his or her overall psychological condition. If these tests reveal that no specific diseases exist, or that the diseases are the result of the patient's social milieu's rejection of homosexuality, the physician should educate the patient that homosexuality is not an illness that can be healed, quote unquote. The doctor should assist the patient in boosting his or her self-esteem and discussing the options for molding his or her life and sexuality without breaking any laws. But unfortunately, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed counselor and he instituted policies aimed at eliminating lives unworthy of living, quote unquote. So, of course, as we all know, the Holocaust, millions of Jews, Soviet and Polish citizens, and much more, and as well as gays and transgender people, were killed as a result of what began as a quote unquote sterilization campaign. Hirschfeld was out of the country where the Nazis actually stormed the institute on May 6th of 1933. His team escaped with what they could. Troops stormed the premises, stealing a bronze bust of Hirschfeld as well as all his valuable books, which they had dumped into the street. More than 20,000 volumes, some of them rare copies that had helped establish a historical graph for nonconforming individuals, were quickly consumed by a tower-like bonfire. On German news broadcasts, the horror had they said that it was one of the first and most significant Nazi book burnings. The damage was carried out by Nazi youth, students, and soldiers, and with voiceovers declaring that the German state had committed a quote-unquote intellectual rubbish of the past. Now, I want you guys to know that this collection was priceless of information that could be extremely valuable to today. Now, there are some books out there that Hirschfeld has written and that we still have knowledge of that you can look up online. It's going to be extremely hard to find those copies, though. I tried to look personally for myself, which is why I go to the library to obtain some of those copies. But if you want to check out those books, guys, I want to, point out that it's extremely informational. So, yeah, let me get back into what we were just talking about. Unfortunately, in 1935, Hirschfeld had passed away. His Institute for Sexual Science had already closed down by the time he had died, unfortunately, and the Scientific Humanitarian Committee had been disbanded. And the surviving presidents of the World League for Sexual Reform were unable and unwilling to hold it together due to political disputes. There were no longer any institutions capable of passing on Hirschfeld's scientific legacy or his social reform. Individuals attempting to carry on Hirschfeld's work in exile and throughout the subsequent conflict faced difficult circumstances, as of course we see today. So I want to say this lastly, looking back on Hirschfeld's Institute's story, his protocol for not only surgery, but also for trans-supportive community of care, mental, physical, therapy, and even social change. It was difficult not to picture a different history. Hirschfeld frequently put his personal happiness and comfort aside for the love and well-being of others. So, for all of us here today listening, I want us to all honor a great hero and pioneer in the fight for sexual and human rights and LGBTQ plus liberation. Now, of course, like I said, I always wanted to end off on letting you guys know that Magnus did a lot for us. And he didn't just do a lot for the transgender community. He did a lot for the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. And I know that this is just a transgender podcast. And I feel as though, yes, we are all our own communities, even though we are all a community together, of course. But I want you guys to know that this man did a lot. All his research, all of his work, all the time that he put into all of this. He tried to make sure that today we had the resources possible to be able to have our surgeries, to have hormone therapy, to have any reconstruction that we want to get done as well. So I want you guys, like I said, to take some time to look into Magnus and his life. Look at all of his previous work that he has done, all his studies and things like that. If you can't find it online, it's definitely at your local library because he has a lot of books published. Would that be, like the university or something like that. But this man did a lot, and like I said, it's difficult to not picture a different history today. But this man definitely did a lot, and he created a lot for us. So that wraps up episode 3, guys, on Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist who pioneered for the LGBTQ plus community and has done tons of work for those in the transgender and intersex community. So I thank you guys for coming out and listening to my podcast today. Of course, we always have new episodes coming out every week on Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So go ahead, please share this podcast to as many people as you like. Social media, I know they got TikToks and all this stuff out there. Go ahead and share this out to as many people as possible because I'm sure everybody wants to know as much as they can about the transgender history that we have today. Also, if you want to, you can follow me on social media at mariiiwrld. That is MAR, 3 I's, WRLD. You can find that, of course, within the podcast description as well if you feel like you couldn't understand what I said. So anyways, like I said, I thank you guys for coming out, of course. Definitely check out Magnus on Google and all those other platforms so you can find any of his work. It's definitely going to be worth the read. And until next time, guys, I appreciate you coming out. And I'll see you next Sunday. Peace.